Good morning, everyone. Welcome this Friday, bright Friday morning, to our webinar. My name is Cynthia. I am a research associate, or is it associate? Yes, here at CIPIT. And today we'll be having our webinar under the subject from policy to practice, industry perspectives on AI governance in East Africa. And to help us go through this discussion today, we have very able panelists who are joining us here today. First, we have Dr. Mary Njeri. Next, Miss Natasha Karanja. And finally, on our panel this morning, we have Miss Josephine Kaniru. And yes, with that, this is our panel for our conversation today. And as stated, the discussion will be under the title and subject from policy to practice, industry perspectives on AI governance in East Africa. And I do believe we have a very able panel to take us through these discussions. In this webinar, the anchor question will be whether we are getting ahead of ourselves, or rather, let me phrase it as a question. Are we getting ahead of ourselves, or are we regulating the policy making for what we are actually using? And I guess this is the first question that I will pose to our panelists. Do we think that we're getting ahead of ourselves? Or yeah, what are your thoughts? I will start with you, Dr. Mary.
This is a very good question, Cynthia. Are we really getting ahead of ourselves? First of all, we need to just be cognizant that AI is here with us, and many other emerging techs are also coming in. And one of the things that I usually tell people is that I think we are the greatest beneficiaries of these emerging techs. Maybe like use cases like how many pathologists do we have in Africa? We're literally just looking at around like less than 3,000, around 2,000. And what is the population of Africa? We're looking at around 1.45 billion. So if you're only having like less than 3,000 pathologists to a population of 1.45 billion, can't we just use AI as an augmenting technology to actually just be able to just have like processes that are actually efficient? So we are greatest beneficiaries when it comes to agriculture. So these different sectors that you're looking at, we are the greatest beneficiaries of actually these particular spaces. But now we need to also be cognizant that we are in different levels. So there's a visible formal level where you're actually now talking about like if you're looking at someone like the fintechs, these guys have actually gone ahead. When you're looking at the aspect of credit scoring, a lot is actually being done in that particular space. But also, there's also this particular person who is looking at it from a point of the agricultural level, but it's literally a black box. So for them, they actually have answers, but they do not know what is actually going on. They can't synthesize all this, but they need those particular solutions. But now you're actually not asking. So have we operationalized the whole process to actually just know that we're actually measuring the metric? We're saying that the metric of success is this, to be able to actually go into the aspect of regulation, or not. So for me, I don't think we are going ahead. We've gone ahead of ourselves when it actually come to this. But I think in the space of regulation, there's a lot that we need to actually just look into. So we're talking about the aspect of before we can go into full-fledged regulation, can we just think about the aspect of just having like something like some sandboxes, get to see how do they actually work before actually now get into in stifling innovation, because that's what at times just bringing in regulations and stating that we need to actually just have them at this without looking at the growing needs, or even the it's called the diffusion of innovation bit of it, not looking at that particular curve, we actually be able to actually stifle innovation. So I think I think we actually, this can actually be in a space where you say it can be debated. Are we getting ahead when it comes to regulations? Are we, so people can actually debate it from different levels. But one of the things I usually say is that in the space that we are in right now, like now, for example, the Kenya bill, the AI Kenya 2026. How I can actually argue from it is that I think what came out really, really strongly was the use of some of these AIs. So like now something like when it comes to technology facilitated gender-based violence, when looking at something like deepfakes, they're really terrorizing people online. So can you actually now be able to say, how do you actually now be able to regulate the aspect of usage of this particular space? And I actually put up a memo to the committee and actually just like argue it from a point of I will reject it, but now I'm looking at it from a point of can actually be able to think about enhancing the SOA, that is the Sexual Offense Act, that is still in 2006, well, yet we're actually in 2026. 20 years later, we still do not have an updated one. So I feel like anyone can actually argue from a different from whatever point, but for me right now, we need to just be able to just slowly as you bring it in, just look at the uses, maybe regulate on the uses, but not regulate on the tech itself. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mary Ngaruiya. Natasha, what do you think?
Okay, thank you, Cynthia, for the question. So, echoing what the doctor has said, I feel like deployment has always been existing when it comes to AI, and frameworks are more or less catching up. I mean, when we do like a mapping and looking at like the existing AI industry, we have fintech companies such as like Apollo Agriculture and Nkopa have been utilizing machine learning to build credit profiles. In Rwanda, we have startups within the health sector that look towards predicting drug demand and automating medical supply. And same case with Uganda and Tanzania. In Tanzania, we have the judiciary, which utilizes AI in terms of transcription and translation. So the question here is more or less looking at what we're regulating in real time and regulating like the use cases that currently exist. In terms of regulation and the sort of impact it has, I think there's a move from soft to hard law, and we're seeing this like with the emergence of the Kenya AI bill. But looking towards soft law, a lot of countries within the EAC region have crafted their own national AI strategies. But more or less, I would say these are sort of like narratives around how they intend to use AI, but not commitments and like hard law commitments that can regulate and create sort of policy environments where AI can be deployed and governed. And the issue here at hand maybe is looking at the risk of over-regulating at early stage adoption. So in terms of regulation, it's a matter of pacing yourself. So looking at how AI currently exists within the environment and designing and creating law that helps regulate the existing environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Joss?
Okay, thank you. So I agree with Dr. Njeri and Natasha in terms of, so we might not necessarily be getting ahead of ourselves if we decide to create policy and regulation for AI, because as I think one of the earlier speakers mentioned, regulation always follows innovation. So innovation has been ongoing. Use of AI and deployment has been ongoing at a very rapid pace. What the concern would be is, what are we creating policies for and what are we regulating? And I think my main critique of the recent AI bill, which was really the first attempt to actually create hard law for AI on the continent. So I think that's a really good effort, and it also shows the, I guess, maturity of our discussions in terms of regulating AI. But my main concern, and I think I'm really echoing what the earlier speakers have said, is that it seemed to be very generalized and to not consider what the baseline is, in terms of adoption, in terms of which industries and which concerns are we trying to address, and in terms of also which populations are we trying to protect in regulating, and also in terms of the age-old practice in Kenya of creating new bodies. I think that was one of the major criticism that we had, is that every law we create, we are creating a new body, and yet we know that Kenyans are always complaining about expenditure and about creating new bodies that are often duplicating functions. And so I think the intentionality that I saw in the creation of Kenya's AI strategy, and the intentionality that I have sort of observed in tracking the development of policies that have come out of that strategy, being the artificial intelligence and emerging technologies policy framework and the data governance policy framework. I feel like if that same intentionality was sort of embedded in the bill, I would have felt it. I don't know. I'm very instinctual in how I look even at documents. And I feel like that intentionality was not there. And so that's really my main point. So we are not necessarily getting ahead of ourselves, but we need intentionality. And one of the main questions we asked when we were, talking about this session is, for example, looking at Tanzania, they had a policy for, I think, AI in health as early as 2022. And so my main question was, had they observed a lot of AI adoption in healthcare? And so they thought that was, a really good area to start, or so that's the question. And the same question I would ask for every country. If you're having an AI strategy, is it reflecting your actual needs, or are you just creating an AI strategy because everyone is creating an AI strategy? An example I will give for Kenya that, in terms of discussions that are ongoing is the Social Health Authority, SHA, the SHA discussion. There's been many dimensions of complaints that Kenyans have around this, but I think I'll cater to just the automated decision making and the algorithmic decision making that's embedded in that service, digital service. And the main concerns arising out of this are, one is the decision being made solely by an automated system, for example, to issue your premiums. Number two, is there an appeal mechanism when this automated system makes a decision that affects your life, right? Number three are what we might call marginalized communities being considered. And I'm saying that in quotes because I think when you're designing systems and you assign such a designation as marginalized communities, you'll often have these human beings as afterthoughts, and I think that's not how you should do it. Just to speak to the final concern that I've mentioned in terms of considering every human when you're designing automated systems and technologies that are applying AI, for example, to deliver government services. In terms of SHA, there's a recent petition that I saw released by Amnesty International, and they wanted SHA to include assistive devices and the ability to buy assistive devices in the SHA benefits package. And that means, for example, today, if you've been contributing to SHA for the last, say, 2 years, you continue contributing, say, for the next 3 years, and then say you get ill, and you have, you face a disability that requires you to buy an assistive device, then you're not going to be covered by SHA. But in the act that created this authority, it says that every 2 years they should have a review of the benefits package. And so this petition is trying to ensure that in the current review that they're going to do, they have to allow people with disabilities to be able to pay for assistive devices using SHA. So that's a really good example of, if we want to now create law, if we want to amend maybe the Social Health Authority Act, Social Health Insurance Act, or if we want to amend the Persons with Disabilities Act of 2025, then we are going to embed this as a targeted need that we actually want to solve for something, not just creating generalized laws that really don't know what they're solving for. I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jess, as well. And I think you've kind of touched on the next question I would like to ask, and even with the challenges that have been highlighted, what, other than what you've highlighted in that case example, what does sector intentionality look like in practice, and who is supposed to be consulted? You've given the example of the AI bill, which came up and you have compared it to the process of how the Kenyan AI strategy was laid and the involvement and intentionality that was put in consulting and just looking into practice and having sector-specific people be part of that process. What are the examples? And this one I'll talk to the other panelists as well. Can we have of sector intentionality being put in practice? And I will start with you, Dr. Njeri.
Okay, maybe I can actually just give just an example of what we've just done when it comes to the data governance period 8. And for this, we're just looking at first of all, you need to have a very consultative kind of discussion with the stakeholders in that particular space. So for this case, you're looking at, first of all, just sitting down and mapping the different people who are definitely, when it comes to data, are actually, they have actually a voice on that. And we're not looking at only the aspect of data in maybe the high levels, but also going down to even the community levels, and be able to just get to sit down with maybe even the CSOs and actually just be able to actually ask, so what are their fears? How do they define maybe like an aspect of data governance? So you literally go to, I call it the wild. You go to the natural environment and you get to just listen. And at the time that actually now coming down to just even like start doing the, just coming up with the different themes, preferably this like now for this particular case, we were able to do a mixed method where we used both qualitative and quantitative. And what actually happened is that the aspect of qualitative, you were able to bring out a lot of rich data from the people. So that now, even when you're actually now drafting this particular kind of policy, when you take it back, people actually seeing their own voices. They're saying they can be able to easily own it. And one of the things that we also brought these people back in the validation workshops to just be able to see that as we are going on developing this particular policy, they're actually seeing what they actually said is still is what has actually been brought in. So at times people get to, you might actually sit down, actually just say, let me bring out this, let me bring out a policy without considering the people who are actually going to actually use it. And what actually happens is that you get a lot of rejection, and I feel like maybe the Kenya this AI bill, that's what is really happening, because there was no involvement of the different other people down there. But at least we can actually attest with the policy, the AI and emerging trends. At least policy, we've actually seen aspects of validation workshops coming in. They're actually building up. So the whole idea, what you're just saying is that if you need to actually just bring in, if you actually want to actually bring in a policy that there's an aspect of ownership, there's an aspect of sustainability on it, you have to actually have to map all the people who are in that particular space and bring it with much rigor. So the rigorness that we actually do with the community research, myself as an academic, is the same rigor that actually just going out to be able to actually like now be able to gather information to bring out this particular policy. We go to the aspect of even looking at aspect of triangulation methods coming in. So where you could actually combine the different kind of methods. So is it workshops? Is it maybe structured, maybe semi-structured kind of interviews? Is it even maybe an aspect of sector mapping kind of workshops? Even allowing even anonymous kind of reporting mechanism. So this can actually just give you a lot of aspects to actually just be able to see what are some of the gaps that are actually there, and these are publicly said. And then now from there, now you're able now to ensure that each and every step, there's an evaluation, each and every step before giving out the final draft, each and every step that the people are actually getting to see that whatever you actually said is actually being put in. So it's all about a very agile, rigorous method that is acceptable, that is actually like co-created with the people who are affected by it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yes, thank you, Dr. Njeri. Natasha?
So to start us off, it's important to understand that this aspect of like sector intentionality means governing the actual use case, not the technology itself. So So an example would be like a rule requiring AI to be explainable is unenforceable. But a rule that healthcare premium setting AI must provide a human readable explanation and a path to human review is enforceable. So here the aspect of what I'm trying to communicate is that AI law cannot stand on its own. It has to be integrated into different sectors for it to gain meaning and nuance within how it's applied and regulated within those sectors. So I think Tanzania adopts this sort of approach where it anchors its AI governance like in specific sectors such as health and education. And then another important aspect to understand is that different sectors more or less carry fundamentally different risk profiles. An example would be like a crop disease detection model and let's say a credit scoring algorithm are both AI, but they're not the same governance problem because they come with different risk classification and consequence. So the importance of a sector-based approach is appreciating that each risk carries its own consequence within their own sector. So regulating it in a sense that each sector has its own rules and classification to ensure that consequence is mitigated and regulated. And then lastly, we need to appreciate that within each different sector, we have to ask who is being consulted and who is missing. So an illustrative example here is that we have the Kenya AI bill, which recently closed off its public comments. So in terms of the call of public comments, procedurally, this is very legitimate as it's in line with the Constitution in terms of public participation, but the realities of stakeholder engagement is how are actual affected communities being like consulted? We're looking at like rural households, like what are the literacy rates in understanding what AI is and the sort of impact it has, and then how are the concerns essentially being translated into actual like actionable points to consider within like legislative making. So in this case, it's more or less having like a grassroots level approach in understanding how concerns are communicated and like evidence-based in terms of legislating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Joss?
Thank you, Cynthia. I really like this question because personally, I am in favor of sector-based approaches in terms of regulating artificial intelligence and generally regulating technologies. I remember in another forum, an attendee asked the question, why do we not create an AI tribunal? You know, and I found that question to be very interesting and in terms of especially outlining what it is that we are trying to say we shouldn't do, I think, in this room, which is you cannot regulate technology, the word technology. You cannot, because technology is everything. Writing is a technology, right? Computers are a technology. Medical devices are technologies. Assistive devices are technologies. There's all kinds of technologies. And so you cannot have one bill that regulates, one act that regulates all technologies. You cannot have one act that regulates AI, because again, the same way I've defined technology, AI is also many things, or at least it the end product that utilizes AI mechanisms can come out in many different ways. And so I'm in favor of that. Just to give, I think, an example of why it's important to consider individuals and to consider communities and to consider sectors, and at the same time, why it's important to let sort of usage run its course as you're also trying to regulate, so that you're not trying to get ahead of something that you don't fully understand. I'll tell you guys a story I read the other day about as basically the conversations of inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities. And it starts in 1193, right? So 12th century, the then Pope Innocent III gave a decree that deaf people could use forms of sign language or earlier forms of sign language to enter into contract, right? So they could buy property, they could marry, and they could, really do anything that humans are allowed to do. 400 years later, of which in the intervening period, people had been actually buying property and going to court and marrying using sign. A man named Thomas Tilsley that's in England. He tried to get married, but he was deaf. And the mayor of the town said, no, you're not smart enough to marry. You don't know what you want. But he would communicate with his family using sign language, using some forms of sign. And his family and his bishop, basically his village, had to actually advocate for him to be allowed to marry. So there was a law that said that, sign language is valid, this man can marry, but in terms of the application of the law, it didn't really translate because of whatever issues arising when we are trying to enforce the generalized laws. And I think this story reminded me of, number one, why laws and policies are important. But number two, just having a law, just having an AI Act doesn't solve all the problems that we want to solve. You actually have to consider what problem will a deaf person be facing when they're trying to buy land? What problem will, if we are to come to the current situation, will a Kenyan who is trying to use their health insurance, what problem will they face? And I think the earlier versions of registration, for example, on the Social Health Authority platform. I think that's going to be my main example, because I've really seen a widespread use of an automated system to just make decisions. In earlier versions, I couldn't see an appeal mechanisms. I've been told currently there's an appeal mechanism, but even that, is it a human being that's actually going to be making that decision? If I get a really high premium and I don't think it's fair for me, am I going to be dealing with a human, or is it the automated system reviewing its decision? And as Natasha was saying, that decision, can I get an explanation? For the data protection regulations, you're supposed to get an explanation that's telling you the logic of why that decision was made the way it was made. And as we're implementing these systems, are we going to give people that, or are we just creating, laws for the few in Nairobi who can understand what AI is and who are using chatbots? And yet you're not considering that a majority of the population who are even using social health authority, who are using public health insurance, may not fully understand these things. So I think for me, that just shows, again, why what we're trying to say is really that consider the people, consider the individuals, consider the use cases, so that you're not just creating generalized laws. I liked the example that Dr. Njeri gave about the Sexual Offences Act. Sexual offences, especially in the technology ecosystem, have really evolved. If you consider from 2006 up to now, that's 20 years. Facebook, I think, maybe became widespread in Kenya around the same time, 2008 or 2009, I don't know. And I'm sure that started there, a lot of TFGBV. It has really ballooned with Instagram and Twitter and all these other, and TikTok and all these other platforms. Has the law caught up? And if we were not creating generalized laws and we were really just seeing a problem and creating a solution for it, we would have, I think, found some legal solutions to some of these problems. So I think going forward, I really commend the process I saw in the creation of the AI strategy and the policies that have come after that. And I'm sure that's happening in other government ecosystems, in other ministries. And I commend that approach. And I think that's how we should regulate technologies and AI and data-based ecosystems. Thanks.
Thank you. I think the thing that is cutting across here is we're all advocating for agile, an agile or sector-based approach. And so at this point, then I ask this question of what then does an agile regulation approach look like in contexts where enforcement infrastructure is still catching up? Again, based on the examples that you have given with the SHA example, also with examples discussed by you, Natasha, we can dream a little and just look at what would an agile regulatory approach, look like in contexts where where the enforcement infrastructure is still catching up. Yes, we can start with you, Dr. Njeri.
I just love the way Josephine is actually giving those really nice examples when it actually comes to the SHA. And what is really interesting is when it comes to the health, I've seen a lot of debate about now when it comes to the MLs being we actually call it explainable AI, where we actually have like people saying, instead of these devices making decisions for us, can we be able to see how they're actually making these particular decisions? So I prefer it, and every time I'm talking to a health practitioner, I usually say I'm going to call it augmented intelligence, not artificial intelligence, because they don't like hearing that at all. And what I can maybe just let you know is that a lot of people are very cognizant when it actually come to development of such systems. So we are slowly moving away from a black box and bringing out using the different kind of technologies out there, the lines coming in, looking at how literally just ensure that you are explaining and you're explaining exactly what you've actually done. And the human in the loop kind of feedback, it's very important to actually just ensure that also this particular human feels that they were there to actually like the way in during the decision making. And now that's now what you're not talking about when talking about now the agile aspect bit of it. So how does the agile regulation look like? So in the context of this technology that is always evolving, the emerging techs and all, we're actually just looking at a context of actually just ensuring that it's actually in the context of front loading accountability, maybe in the aspect of procurement and also deployment processes, rather than just relying on the after the fact kind of inspection. So here we're just saying something like, can you actually have like mandatory impact assessments where we can be able to, before deploying maybe this kind of like AI high risk kind of like data, or even these high risk sectors. So and definitely for this one now, maybe just be guided by who is actually regulating it. So these particular templates coming out, they're actually going to actually aid in this area a lot. So we're talking about sector specific kind of codes of practice coming in with these particular industries, be able to just be able to just ensure that the technical expert is actually applied in this space. And also as we're looking at this bit, so as agility is actually coming in, also we need to be very careful when it actually comes to the space of copy pasting some of these maybe even architecture into maybe some of these bills or arts coming out into our own space when it comes to we need to tell you maybe like look at the aspect of interrogating are these particular architectures actually matching the Kenyan conditions? Are they actually matching? Do we have like this mature market that you're looking at? Do we have these large deployers that you actually look stating when you're looking at the kind of models we're actually looking at, trying to learn from out there. So, and that's the reason why now it actually now takes us back to, as we're looking at the agility bit of it, there's an aspect of still also ensuring that you're co-creating with the people to actually just get to see how this particular tool actually like looking at the different facets and be able to be brought in. So agility for me, how it looks like, it's literally, as I said before, front loading, accountability, other than just after the fact inspection. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Njeri. Natasha?
Okay, so for me, understanding what agile regulation is more or less regulation that's designed for the actual enforcement environment. So this looks at using existing institutions, proportionate instruments, and more or less like mandatory review cycles and design inputs drawn from the context it will actually govern. So what does this look like in practice? So we look at mapping at what already exists. So for me, the most effective AI governance route is through institutions that already carry actual legitimacy, enforcement staff, and established relationships like with industry. So in this case, I know the Kenyan AI bill more or less looks at a new AI commissioner. So a plausible suggestion in this case would be using existing bodies such as the ODPC that already like holds data handling powers, like an institutional mandate and enforcement precedent. So expanding its scope to like look at AI oversight as a faster and more or less cheaper and more credible structure. And we also look at the copy and paste approach that has been mentioned. So again, I know a standalone law or like a benchmark law that is usually public and popular is the EU AI Act. So in this case, it's not really like a template, The act itself was written in anticipation of systems that had yet not been deployed, and it was written for high administrative capacity jurisdictions, like with actual formalized data ecosystems. So assessing like the East African region, I would say that differing conditions in terms of like we have informal economies, we have labor and commerce and thin regulatory capacities that exist, and that AI is already running in these sort of areas. So it's creating AI legislation that is mapped out towards like our nuanced situations. Then another thing to maybe appreciate and understand is that there is need to move, there's need to regulate and have flexible regulation as we develop and deploy AI. And as mentioned by the previous panelists, the Shah situation, I mean, that was one which AI governance had to come into play in terms of like risk classification, algorithmic impact assessments, and testing the actual system before it was actually deployed. So in this case, it's more of paced, cautious, and intentional regulation using our existing structures to ensure that, we're creating a safe environment for AI to be deployed. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Justin?
Thank you. So on what agile regulation looks like, I won't say much because if I did, I would be repeating what the other panelists have said. So I agree with everything, especially in terms of leveraging on the existing institutions, leveraging on the existing laws to see where you can make changes. Last year, I had, from the ministry that they had a process in an attempt to amend 23 statutes that were touching on AI concerns, and I was very curious, and it sounded exciting, but then I don't know how far that process has gotten, but it just sounded like, for an idealist, that sounded like the way to go, right? So in terms of institutions and the laws, I really think let's leverage on the existing ones. Let's not have AI tribunals and AI commissions because also, the financial burden on the just ecosystem doesn't sound sustainable. Also, there's going to be a new technology, or a new sort of offshoot of emerging tech. Are we going to also create a new body for that? And finally, on that, the section or the provision in the Data Protection Act that talks about automated decision making and automated processes. Basically, I think that's a really important provision to look at in terms of how the ODPC's mandate has actually already been regulating AI. It's just that maybe we are not leveraging enough of that. When we start saying we need a new body and we need a new regulator, then we are really not recognizing also the work that the ODPC is able to do and the capacity that they have, especially because of the enabling laws that they have. The Data Protection Act and the regulations are really, really explicit in terms of the process that should be carried out when you're using systems to automate decision making. Finally, what I will say on agile decision making, and I think it's really just a summary of all that we are saying, is don't listen to outsiders. Look within. It sounds very woo and very whatever, but yeah, just look within. And I think I've seen this process happen on the continent a lot since I got into this field around 2022. I saw a lot of just African policymakers, African researchers and advocates and advocacy organizations all saying we want to create tech governance that is African and that's paying attention to our concerns and that's paying attention to our context, our languages, our challenges, our development concerns and development goals. And I think we should really hone in on that. Let's keep doing that. And one group of people that I will say that we should not listen to in terms of just listening within is we cannot be listening to the creators of this technology to tell us how to regulate these technologies, right? So let's just look at our concerns. Sure, it's good to pay attention to the wider scope of the technology and AI development that are happening. But I think it helps to look within so that we know what do we want to address for ourselves as Kenya, and then as East Africa. If we want to also look at integration, I think this conversation was also addressing a bit of how do we integrate in, with agility, right? How do we integrate, the East African community and the African Union ecosystem with agility, making sure that we are not, again, having one big general act or a binding, treaty for the EAC that's not really considering the actual concerns that individual countries are facing. I think I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Trust. And I think it's with that last point then that I'd like to pose this question to you, Natasha. With what Trust has said, or how then do we integrate? How then do we move beyond, even when we're looking within, move beyond and integrate with the largest African community with agility? And ask you what would cross-border harmonization realistically require in the East African region, and where do national frameworks diverge in ways that matter?
Okay. So I would say in terms of harmonization, the architecture already exists. So the question at hand is activation. So looking at examples, the East African community has its AI strategy. There's also the recent AI declaration and digital transformation strategy, as well as the overarching AU continental strategy. So I'd say these all provide more or less like a normative baseline, but they're not really enough on their own. So they need this sort of operational mechanisms to ensure that they're actually actualized and integrated within domestic jurisdictions. So one of the ways this can be actualized is, let's say, like a mutual recognition of risk classification. So let's say if Kenya designates like a credit scoring as a high risk AI application, a harmonized East African framework would mean that designation travels across region. So what exists in Kenya as high risk would exist in Uganda. So let's say like if a Ugandan fintech deploying the same system in Kenya cannot essentially like arbitrage between different jurisdictions. Another key example we would look at is the idea of cross-border data governance as the hardest piece to essentially map out in terms of harmonization. So across East Africa, I would say that proprietary data is held by different private companies. So in terms of cross-data flows, there would be need for this idea of data sharing frameworks, especially within private industry, to ensure that data is shared in a manner that's secure and like legally compliant. And then another thing to consider is that harmonization requires the idea or resolving who governs at national level. So in this case, I don't think you can harmonize what is fragmented. So within the East African region, I think countries have not resolved which institutions govern AI domestically. So it's important to more or less creating this common point where there is need to ensure that, there's this sort of authoritative stance on each country individually before we create that sort of common player in terms of regulation. And this is how more or less regional alignment can occur and can be actualized. And lastly, just to summarize that realistic cross-border harmonization, especially within the East African region, is more or less like a set of agreed minimum standards, in this case, like risk classification, audit obligations, and jurisdictional rules, where national frameworks can implement these minimum standards that are mutually be recognizable and respectable. And this is what can be achieved and actualized within the regional setting. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Dr. Njeri or Joss, you could also jump on this question.
What I would probably do is show how this has been happening already, I think, which can guide us in terms of where to go as we go forward. So how there has been some form of harmonization, I think, globally in terms of governing data and governing emerging technologies, including AI. There's been a lot of soft law, a lot of instruments that sort of define what principles we should adhere to when trying to create policy and govern artificial intelligence. And at the African level, there's a binding treaty, that's the Malabo Convention. That's the African Union Convention on Data Privacy and Cybersecurity, I believe it's called. And the Malabo Convention really defines what a lot of African data protection laws and data protection and cybersecurity laws have adopted in terms of general principles, in terms of what provisions are, in terms of what rights data subjects have, and what obligations data handlers have. So that continental instrument has guided how the national laws look like, and I think that now even at the East African level, for example, the main role that soft law at the EAC level can play is in terms of guiding how the countries that don't have data protection laws and data governance laws and policies, how they can go about that. That's, I guess, step one, but that still doesn't make for interoperable sort of ecosystems and laws. How to harmonize and how to fully harmonize laws and obligations, so that, for example, if a data handler has a company in Kenya that also operates in Rwanda, they don't have to duplicate efforts and duplicate budgets and duplicate, documentation. I think that's a tall order. That's something I'm thinking through at the moment. But I think at the bare minimum, harmonizing at least how the laws look like, so that it's easier for people to meet their obligations in each country, then that's step one. The reason I guess I have concerns around that level of harmonization and interoperable laws is, if you look at the Malabo Convention, the ratifications that it needed to come into force were 15. So it was created in 2014. It came into force in 2023. Close to 10 years later, that's when they could get 15 ratifications out of the 54 countries. And at the moment, I don't think the ratifications are even at 20 in number. I think that they're still around 16 or 18, something like that. So I think having one binding document or one binding legal framework that all countries in a regional economic community or on the African Union can adhere to, that's very difficult at the moment. But I think at least the fact that we have similar laws helps. It helps. The other thing I would highlight in terms of, just at least making it easier for data handlers, and I guess now as we talk about AI governance for AI deployers and AI developers to adhere to these laws, is there's a lot of harmonization in terms of the people, because I think the other thing I'm really learning as we have these discussions is it's not about the laws and the technology, it's about the people, So when we talk about governments being able to enforce laws, it's about the people and the intentionality that these people in government, in regulator bodies and in parliaments have, and also the political will. And something I would highlight is there's a collaboration. It's called NADPA. I don't have the full name right now, but NADPA is like a collaboration among all data protection authorities on the continent. And they have, I think, annual conferences or something. And they meet up and they sort of, they share ideas and share their progress, so that I think there's some harmonization that comes out of that, so that if I have a business here and in South Africa and in Namibia and say in Morocco, on the continent, there's a similar language that's being used when we are regulating data. And so I think adopting that also for AI regulation, I think that really matters. I think it matters when people meet and share ideas, because there's a similar language that cuts through discussions, and then that's the language, because these really are the people creating the laws. That's the language that's also going to reflect in the laws that are created.
Thank you, Trust. Yes, it's at this point that I'd like us to get into our Q&A. I see that one has already been answered, and these questions will be posed to the panelists, so whoever would like to can answer. But before then, I think the thing that has come out in our conversation and our discussion today is that one, when we look at the point on harmonization, it's not that the frameworks are not there, we just need to activate them with the examples given by Joss and those shared by Natasha and Dr. Njeri as well. And again, even as we think about AI governance within the industries, the approach that has been shared when it comes to regulatory of the same is that an agile and sector-specific approach is what's best. With that which Natasha pointed out, AI works within sectors. It doesn't stand alone. Therefore, that's how it gets activation. And with that, then we should think of regulating AI at the sector level, and have it that way. And we do have some questions from some of our attendees. One of which has already been answered, but we'll ask the question. It's one question, three questions in one. And this is on AI governance in East Africa. So the first question is, how would you say the regulatory framework for AI in Kenya is focused? So is it more regulating utility on AI, or do you see if the core underlying tech and impact to our use case is the direction? Natasha, do you mind taking this one?
Okay, so to give my attempt at an answer, I would say it's a mix of both essentially. I mean, when we're looking at regulation of AI, yes, we regulate its utility in terms of how it's applied and utilized within different industries and how it affects people. So maybe that's in the case of its utility and impact. I mean, looking at or piecing current regulation, especially within the Kenyan setting, we have our national AI strategy, and that more looks towards how AI can be utilized, not necessarily its impact. So it's looking at how AI integrates into like our existing like ecosystem and how it can essentially help us amplify like our developmental goals. The bill more or less now looks towards its impact, which is currently being legislated and discussed. So yes, I'd say the bill more or less looks at the impact per se, and the strategy more looks at its utility and how it's used. Yeah.
Thank
Okay. Maybe I can also add to that. So I think to the attendee asking the question, I will say the regulatory ecosystem is still shaping itself. And I think that's why this is the opportunity we have to actually advocate for how we want it to look like. And I think that's part of the purpose of this webinar. I agree with Natasha that there's both aspects appearing, and something I would like to highlight just in connection to what we were saying earlier, in terms of you can't have just one generalized law to govern all of AI, because the way AI is affecting communities spans everything really. And an example I would give is how AI is affecting labor. And again, even that has, like I could point to maybe 4 aspects of how it's affecting labor, right? So there's the labor disruptions, but you can also just come back to the creation of AI and the curation of data that trains AI, and how we have seen Kenyan workers affected by that process. So you can't divorce, AI from that discussion of data workers, for example, right? And we have seen that Kenyan law as it exists has been able to, the Kenyan judiciary at least has been able to interpret law in a way that enforces these workers' rights, right? So that's just one example. So there's scattered, I don't know if that's the best word, but there's a scattered application of how we are regulating AI. And I think that's the best approach, because I was actually trying, as we were, designing our comments and our memo for the AI bill, I kept wondering, do we need to design what we think it should look like? And if we were to do that, what would it look like? Because it's a very wide, it sounds like a very wide one general act. And I think that's even the EU AI Act is very, very wide because it has to cater to a lot of aspects. But just to give that example that it's happening all over the place. We earlier gave the example of the Data Protection Act and the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner and how they are actually regulating AI in one way or another. And then we're also seeing the courts make decisions. We saw the Meta case, with Summersource, who was the BPO that Meta had outsourced work to. That case really highlighted how the courts can protect workers affected by AI. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of litigation around other aspects. Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's a wide question that requires a very wide and well thought out answer. But I think the answer does not lie in one body or one regulatory instrument. I really think that's the answer. It's a very general question, and so it requires targeted answers for each concern. Thanks.
Thank you so much, yes, Dr. Njeri.
Maybe I can actually just add on that, and I'm sorry I dropped off. So when it comes to, definitely it requires both. When it comes to the utility-facing language, there is now the aspect of actually just having those specific contexts. In reference to maybe like something like computer protection and aspect of rights, we are looking at now the different kind of use cases that Josephine also actually mentioned. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what Natasha actually said. But also, it's also looking at also being, we call it, it's also technology facing. It has a technology facing also language. That means now there's an aspect of we need to move towards what are the contextualized definitions of AI systems. Other than just having those generic, like not what just actually saying, let it not be broad, let it be very specific. So definition of these AI systems, when actually coming to references of algorithmic kind of decision making, what exactly are we doing in that particular space? All this so that you can actually be able to now when now we're looking, so that you can be able to now look at the aspects like what Justin was actually asking about, the human in the loop, this is augmented kind of intelligence. So to actually understand how the systems are actually working and without it being a black box and how they can actually be regulated. So it's a facet of the two. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Njeri, Natasha, and Joss. It's at this point that we're coming to the end of our webinar today. I believe the other question that was asked has been responded to, Audrey, via the Q&A section. And I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity to give us their parting shot on this conversation. And what would your last words be? We'll start with you, Dr. Njeri, go to Natasha, and finish off with Josephine.
Okay, thank you. My parting shot, each and every time, let's not be scared of tech going ahead of everything else. It will always do that. So the bit is also when it comes to the aspect of policy, be it also bringing in the aspect of soft and hard laws. Let us participate in these particular activities, because when we actually give out our voices, we get to actually see, because now we are the expertise in these particular areas and we are the daily users of these particular checks. Let's give our voices so that now at least we'll be able to see policies are actually very much aligned with what is in the natural, not just maybe copy and pasted kind of policies. So there will be different like participations, like now for example the AI bill 2026. I hope you guys gave your you gave in your responses to it. So let's always be participants of these particular spaces, so you can actually be able to grow a sustainable ecosystem when it actually comes to AI in Kenya and beyond. Thank you.
For me, I would say that what we can already see is that deployment is already ahead of governance. in most of these East African countries. So the question here is not whether to regulate, it's whether regulation is grounded in what is actually deployed and whether it's designed for the enforcement environment that currently exists and whether it's built to adapt and move as technology moves ahead.
Thank you. I think mine would be to also say that, yes, we are actively shaping what technology adoption looks like for us. And I am saying this, as I mentioned earlier, since I joined this space around 2022, I have seen, efforts to contextualize policy making and regulation efforts to our situation, to African and Kenyan context. And I think if one tracks what has been going on since 2022 up to now, and as we go forward, even if the technology is always outpacing policy and governance efforts, I have seen sort of the value of these policy discussions and these policy efforts. So I would say let's continue on that same path. I think everyone in the room is engaged in one way or another in policy work or advocacy around governance of technology. So I would say your efforts are not, they're not just, you're not throwing them into a vacuum. I think they are actively shaping how we want to see technology affect us and especially right now, because I know also Kenyans are very active in the civic space. And I think, we can see actual efforts and actual results from those efforts. So I would say, let's keep doing that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Njeri. Thank you so much, Ms. Natasha Karanja, and thank you so much, Ms. Josephine Kaniru. I hope to our audience and attendees that you've enjoyed this session. And it's at this point that I'd like to extend the invites to our next webinar, which should be happening soon, which is the third webinar in this webinar series. More details on that will be shared on our social media platforms. Just, do you have something to add? I see your hand is raised.
Okay, thank you. I spoke earlier about our work around inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities. We are planning to have a focus group discussion with people who work in that space. So if you do work around inclusion, you can kindly reach out to us. You can reach out to us at cipit@strathmore.edu, so that we can invite you in that focus group, because I think it would be really good to hear your views and what your work looks like around inclusion and accessibility for people with disabilities. So if you do work around inclusion, reach out to us and we are going to have you in the room so that we can hear your views. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you so much, Ross. You preempted. It was one of the other items I was going to highlight. So one, there is that. Two, we have our next webinar, the final webinar in this webinar series that we've been having. So be on the lookout for those details on our socials. Yes, you can find us at CIPIT on LinkedIn and I think YouTube. Yes, I think those are the only platforms they're on. And finally, is to also share that we do have it's a webinar of sorts. It's a discussion series on AI and IP, where we are discussing issues that cut across both AI and intellectual property. We will be having one of those discussion sessions later in this month, so please be on the lookout for those. A QR code should be coming up right now. For those, if you're interested, you can register, but if it doesn't come up again, you can check out. Yes, there we go. Yes, it is our learning and development program by CIPIT, and if you are interested, you can scan the QR code and complete the form therein. And the subject matter we are addressing in this learning and development program is AI and intellectual property. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for staying on. Thank you so much to our panelists for making our discussion what it was, and to those who've attended. We're very, very grateful. From here at SIPIT, we wish you a wonderful remainder of your Friday and an awesome weekend ahead. Thank you so much.